which was not only not less money on farm subsidies than we were before the reform, we were spending more money on farm subsidies. And the reason why we were spending more money on farm subsidies is because the economic conditions in the agricultural sector took a turn for the worse, and farmers said, oh, our private profits are down, and we need extra help, and it's been a bad winter, and blah, 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 blah. And they have a lot of friends in Washington. They went back to Washington, and they say, well, when we passed that reform, we had no idea that these market conditions were going to be so bad. And the farmers from the farm states said, well, no one had any idea that the weather could get bad, and so we must bail out the family farmer. So to compare institutional shifts across reforms, I've talked about three: the Tax Reform Act of 1986, the airline deregulation, and freedom to farm. Let me recap airline deregulation first. Again, extensive shifts in governance. We eliminated the CAB. Subsequent court rulings reinforced the deregulatory path, creating a high barrier to proving predatory pricing cases, and the post-9/11 bailout was conducted by a temporary board with a narrow mission. In sharp contrast, in the taxation and the agriculture sectors, we do not see the same kind of governance shifts. Tax reform, we see no shifts in powers in tax policy committees. The Ways and Means Committee in Congress, nothing changes. It was valuable to be on the Ways and Means Committee in 1985 before reform because you get a lot of campaign contributions from these business lobbyists. And you know what? It was just as valuable in 1987. In fact, if anything, more valuable because now they were trying to recoup their past losses. The transaction costs to creating new tax breaks, new tax barriers, were not increased. It was very easy for Congress to do it before. It still is easy. There's nothing new. There's no real new obstacle to that. There was one reform that was layered atop the 1986 tax reform, wasn't anticipated when tax reform was adopted, that did help briefly promote the reform sustainability. And that's important to keep in mind is that a reform sustainability is going to be affected by whatever legislation comes after it. Some of it could help it accidentally, right? You might get a subsequent law that's reinforcing the path. Back in 1990, Congress passed a deficit reduction act called the Budget Enforcement Act that had this thing called pay-go that said if you open up a new tax break that loses money, you got to find the money from somewhere else in the budget. And so that made it less attractive for Congress to create tax breaks for a couple of years. But then that Budget Enforcement Act lapsed when the United States government started running budget surpluses briefly in the late 1990s, which seems incredible to remember now that we briefly, the big problem in Washington was what are we going to do with these surpluses, which was part of the argument why we needed big tax cuts. That did not work out well. Freedom to farm. Here, we also do not see extensive shifts in governance arrangements. The permanent law on the books of the federal government that provides the underlying authority for the federal government to be in the business of doling out benefits was not repealed. And so we layered atop this market transition thing, but we kept in place that underlying 1949 law. There was a shift in congressional arrangements, but it was temporary. Now, the one thing that I think is very important to see here is that reforms can last in some ways and not last in others, right? Reforms can be multifaceted. So there was another part of this reform that did last. And that's very important not to paint with too broad a brush. Again, we saw a lot of feedback effects in airline deregulation, building new constituencies, changing the coalitional alignments, causing interest groups to fragment in a way that actually helps sustain the reform. In the other two cases, we do not see those kinds of patterns. We do not see new coalitions. We do not see, for example, the disempowering of tax lobbyists in the tax arena. We do not see somehow farmers' images being stigmatized and all of a sudden it's unseemly to give out farm subsidies. No, it's still quite attractive on the campaign trail to say you're a pro-farmer. Nothing has changed. The debate hasn't changed. It hasn't been reframed. The old kind of politics is still there. Oops. Okay, so to wrap up, what can we do to try to promote reform sustainability? First of all, and most importantly, we need to anticipate sustainability problems ex ante. We need to be ever mindful we might run into trouble down the road. And we can use forward and backward mapping techniques. Some of you might have, I don't know if you teach this in your programs, thinking about what are the specific set of steps going forward that I need to be aware of to make this reform work. And where are the risks? Where are the soft spots? What could go wrong? Also need to remember that reforms typically are most vulnerable during their early years. When you pass a reform, it is like an infant. It is not ready to be independent. It is not ready to stand on its own 2 feet. It cannot crawl yet. It can't speak. It has all the potential to grow maybe into a fully formed adult, just like a reform, but that reform cannot stand on its own 2 feet. It needs help in those early years. We can use policy design to stimulate durable shifts in governance and group identities. We need to be careful about front-loading costs and back-loading benefits, because then you have not built up a constituency for the reform. This is exactly why, one reason why Obama's healthcare reform is in big trouble. Because for budgetary reasons, he was trying to keep the near-term costs low. It's not very generous in the early years. It doesn't give anybody much of anything. So the opponents are quite unhappy about it, but where's the new stakeholders in the new system? Who's going to defend this reform? They don't really see very much benefit, and they're not going to see it till 2014. Well, guess what's going to happen between now and 2014? 2 elections. 2 elections. Okay. Be strategic about the use of side payments and compensation schemes. Don't just rent supporters. Try to find ways to reallocate power so that the receipt of those benefits makes it harder for those recipients to come back and fight another day. It can require complex legal arrangements. It's not easy, but sometimes you can devise governance arrangements that create barriers to those groups that receive the transition. Cultivate clienteles. Create sunk costs by establishing new property rights. This is one of the reasons why the American acid rain emission permit trading system has worked so well. Is there are new actors that have rights to emit sulfur dioxide, and they own those rights, and they're valuable for them. They don't want to see those rights taken away, and they have new stakeholders. Don't implement reforms without establishing the bureaucratic capacity and the legal authority needed to make them work. And this is a particular problem in the United States because our state capacity is weak, and we have a difficult time building state capacity. Don't rely on minimum winning coalitions. It's not necessarily a great thing to pass a reform by 2 votes. You might want to modify your reform to get a broader coalition that makes it more likely that the reform coalition is still going to be intact even if the next couple of election results are unfavorable. Narrow legislative margins can invite trouble, which is not to say that passage by a lopsided majority eliminates trouble. It's just you're asking for trouble if you're passing it by 1 vote. Invest significant organizational and financial resources in long-term reform monitoring and advocacy. Recognize that reform consolidation is less sexy than reform adoption. Don't count on continued media interest. You need to draw attention to the achievements of your reforms, continually talk about them, highlight them, make people aware that the reforms are doing good things. And unmask attempts to unravel the reform. Lots of efforts by narrow constituency groups and stakeholders to destroy a reform can take place in obscure bureaus and government proceedings when no one is looking. So don't think that just because something is a 3rd-tier sort of venue means that nothing is happening there. Be very vigilant about what is going on there. Reforms are often eroded in back rooms. Subsidize collective action costs for dispersed beneficiaries. Encourage actors who played key roles in reform adoption to remain seriously involved in the issue. This is very important. Usually there are a few key politicians or staff people, principals, and their high-ranking people that were very instrumental to the reform. They know the most, they have the most interest, they have the passion, but what has often happens, at least in America, is their attention turns to other issues. Well, they need to understand their work is not done. Their leadership is needed, at least to get through that first early stage, that first 7, 8 years in America. That's typical of how long it takes to consolidate a reform. So view policy reform as a long-term project with evaluation occurring at multiple stages, each of which should be forward-looking. And that is to say that progress should be judged not simply in terms of whether the reform is delivering benefits to the public at the moment, but whether the reform has reconfigured the political context in which subsequent decisions get made. Thank you.